We're going to start off with a talk about chronotopes while we wait for our guests when we get into toxic masculinity. I mean,
Oh,
toxic masculinity has to be one of the most awful chronotopes of all time with a male power figure, the male ego, the narcissist chronotope, in space time. So here we have Cassandra Rebellio. Sounds like rebel with a low on it,
it's
rebel low.
very accurate for me as a person,
So she's a
unfortunately.
rebel, rebelling and redoing Mikhail Bakhtin's chronotope. So tell us all about it.
Okay, no. So here's my question. My question is, do do we have the ability to exist either outside of chronotopes, or do we create our own chronotopes? But if they never become understood, are they still chronotopes?
All right, here's the answer. You ready? Okay, because I actually have been working on this for 30 years, so I actually have some ideas. Uh, yes, you could be outside the chronotopes because the chronotopes are made from the anti-narrative bits and pieces that go to the editing floor, like when they do the hero's journey with Joseph Campbell, that adventure narrative kind of chronotope, usually a male hero, by the way. And then on the editing floor, they put all the micro story, all the little stories of the little people and all the stuff that doesn't fit in the chronotype. So if you think about a narrative, what is it? It's a set of events, but not, is it all of the events around that? No, it's a few events and a few characters, not all the characters, just a few characters, the male lead, the helpers, right? They go on, uh, they get the call to adventure. The helpers join. Maybe more helpers join. They go out. They first they're defeated, then they're defeated again just to make it look good, be a great movie. And then the final climax. They almost are gonna lose, but they win, and then they bring back the boon, kind of like the knowledge, the secret knowledge, and they bring it back to the community. And there's a big celebration like Star Wars, a big Star Wars celebration, or Harry Potter, you know, Star Trek, yeah, in some episodes. And then right, it's the hero's journey, it's got a beginning and
Okay,
end.
that's kind of what I was thinking. So
But
I have
that's not all of it. It's an abusive context.
yeah, so
It's
I
not
have one
not it.
one
Go,
question,
go.
one more question, and then Ronnie's going to do his presentation. I'm really excited. Because I'm studying authenticity and legitimacy. Here's my question. Is an authentic orientation to understanding how we exist a void of the need for chronotopes, and alternatively a legitimate orientation requires chronotopes to
Okay.
make sense?
Here's the answer. I got to give it quick because Ronnie's ready. Ronnie's ready to
No,
go.
you're
Ready to
good. You're
go.
good, Dave. You're good, David.
Okay. So uh, now you're if you can drop out of your head space, Cassandra, you know, and just take the elevator down to your heart. Take the elevator down to your heart. It's that easy. You take the elevator down to your heart. Now you're in your heart space. Let's assume you do that. You're breathing, breath of life, in, out, breath of life, right? Now, when you do that, what we talked about yesterday in the session was that uh, with Tim Long, Ken's brother, I believe his name is Tim. Did I get that right, Paul? Is his name Tim? I get it all screwed up.
And I think.
Timothy Long. Yeah. So he says, love is truth and truth is love. So in your head, the truth is not in your head. Okay. I don't care what good empiricist you are, it's not in your head. Down here in your heart, if you put both hands middle of the chest over your heart, you breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, then clear the clutter from your mind. Clear all that multitasking. What am I going to do now? What's next in my dissertation? Da, da, da. What do my kids want their dinner? Where's my husband? Da, da, da. Where is he? So you clear all that out. You clear it out. You get into your heart space. And that's when you're in touch with the quantum field of the universe. And in that quantum field of the universe, whatever your beliefs, I don't know your beliefs, Judaism, Christianity, spirituality, atheist, whatever you are, or you're a Betty, just a Betty. Then so you're in touch with your heart is truth. Your truth is heart. That's when your true authentic self is there. The rest of it is all bullshit. Aho. And I'll turn it over to Ronnie.
Okay.
So, speaking of getting out of our head space and into our heart space, the thing I'd like to talk to you about today is the work I've been doing in understanding the nature of masculinity and men's mental health. This started many years ago working with David and Grace Ann with the veterans, and thinking about the way I have been duped by masculinity. The first thing that patriarchy demands is not compliance by women, but self-mutilation by men of their emotion. And the first step to moving, to growing, to bringing back that part of yourself is giving yourself permission to feel. This chart is at the front of the book, Permission to Feel. And whenever I bring up this chart, which as you can see shows that we can call ourselves uneasy or unsure before we get to angry, before we're enraged, I bring this up and the men in the class say, "Oh, I've never heard of that word." And they start pointing to words over in this green area. They start pointing to words in the yellow area. They start pointing out that of all the ways someone can perform an emotion, they've been limited to a very narrow range. In the same way, men also will say red, yellow, blue, green without a depth of colors. And emotions, like colors, exist, but as perception, the way we expect the world to exist. This, from the book, How Emotions Are Made, shows us that our minds are set on an expectation. When that expectation can be fulfilled, we slot it into those expectations. So emotions then become not soft cultural, like social constructions, but rather social reifications, cultural reifications, realities that we take for granted as if they are so real we can't question them. But what an individual experiences internally as they perform what looks like a particular emotion, this is highly varied. We all have these different hearts, but we're expected to express similar heads. If we can help people see that they can, in fact, feel, see that there are these other words and other emotions, they can start adding those words to their vocabulary, identifying them, and expecting to see them. When teachers were also involved, young men who were given this permission to feel chart and shown how to give vocabulary to their other emotions in a school with an 80% dropout rate fell to a 20% dropout rate. because these emotions are built into us, but we can work on them. Now, the next thing that I've learned about patriarchy is that there are allowed emotions, anger and lust. A man is allowed those too. But this is a thin soup for the soul. To have only anger as what you're allowed to express, and even then, 0 to 60. And then to try and find in some sort of physical connection the rest of your emotional complexity is putting too much on any one person and making your life much thinner and more empty if you're a man. To be able to find your own capacity to experience and express these other emotions is your ability to overcome the patriarchal violence that's built in. And that violence expresses itself through anger and lust. And that then forms the groundwork of our identities. People exist, but they exist in a community. They wear masks. They put on plays. They put on plays not knowing it as they perform emotions. They put on plays not knowing as they perform identities. I remember distinctly thinking to myself, who do I want to be? And answering with two things: Jean-Luc Picard and Jack Black from School of Rock. And I play into that. And I continue to play into that. Many men look out and see patriarchal figures that they play into. But if we start to recognize that that is a part of us, but not all of us, that we would exist with that part without us, that those parts of us that we already know are a problem, that little narrative is good for us in some ways. It is benefiting us. When we can recognize the part of the identity narrative, like the part of Jack Black where he doesn't pay his rent, that is harming us, when we can recognize the benefits of that part of the narrative fully, explicitly, as best as we can, that narrative will no longer sit in our back pocket to come out. I don't know why I do that. Instead, we'll be able to confront who we are and why we're doing this bad thing. Then we can balance it against the negative. And then we must be honest and vulnerable with ourselves. Maybe someone smokes every time they drive, and they know smoking is bad. Maybe they say to themselves, what is the benefit of smoking when I drive? It calms me. It calms me, and then I don't have road rage and I can get to work. Maybe they walk away still being smokers, but they've walked away accepting themselves for where they are, which remains an opportunity to change should that negative outweigh the positive. Being able to work past toxic traits of masculinity is not throwing away what it means to be masculine. It's being fully aware of the various narratives and the benefits they bring, and truly empathizing with yourself in those benefits. However, if we can then say, yes, I do want to change this narrative, then we can go back to the future, right? We can go back to aspects of ourselves that do not include that particular narrative. And then when we share that new way of being with our community, they will uphold that new way of being. And sometimes that means leaving the community we were a part of because it keeps reminding us that we're supposed to be playing a role they expect. And that's difficult and painful, and an understandable reason someone wouldn't change. But accepting yourself for who you are and why you are that way gives you the capacity to think about when and where it would be the right thing. And so entering into this reflexive understanding of your community as upholding who you are and the role that you're playing and the expectations of emotions that have limited the emotions that one has been able to express, that is what allows us to bring more emotions in, to trial new things and try to publicize a new way. Yeah. All right. That was like a lot in a little bit of time and said like with big passion. So, love to have a conversation.
So, Ronnie, so what I hear you saying is we got shadow sides in our male, of our toxic male, and some of that toxic male is despicable, I would say, and misguided, and we're only in touch with half of the feeling zone, you know, and we're denying those feelings of joy and happiness and bliss and peace and patience. And I don't memorize the whole list, but it was a beautiful list. Uh, so I think for me, I remember being toxic male on that side, coming out, going into the Vietnam War, trying to survive high school bullies, trying to learn to fight bullies, and just surviving, you know. And then second marriage, I met Grace Ann. She introduced me to all these wonderful emotions that we went to insight seminars and stuff. So I guess what I'm saying is it possible for us to reconfigure our toxic male chronotopes over time? Would be the question.
And the chart you were referring to is here. I mean, step one is for my students to be able to say, I feel alienated. Because they'll take a real feeling of alienation and act like they're enraged. Easier than that, even, is to say, I'm uneasy or unsure, starting to get peeved over here, so that we don't have such a limited emotional range of like 3 boxes on angry, right? Allow ourselves to feel anguished instead of panicked, instead of livid. Okay.
I see Betty's got a hand up. Go, Betty. And then Grace Ann is waving. So that's a sign.
Okay, it's a great sign. Yeah, Ronnie, I think that's beautiful. You put the right tone to it, just the right amount of information, a lot packed in, but all of it digestible. And so I'm left with going, huh. And two things snap into my mind right away. One is, why in the world would a society do such a thing to its males? And then my next thought was, well, toxic femininity might come from the same thing as well. We often hear about mean girls or how competition between women can get really nasty. But what I'm wondering, so this is my theory I'd like you to react to. Parents are, and society is, worried that their men are going to be weak instead of protecting the the whole society. In other words, by not letting them feel emotion, they're hoping that when they go to war, they'll be a GI Joe from the get-go. And the reason I think that would matter more to the states is these 17 big wars and all the little ones in between have turned us into a warrior nation. So is there some kind of contract between society and men that they won't show any problems in case they need to be sent off to war.
I'm going to listen to everyone's comments and then talk that way. I can hear everyone in their thoughts.
Well, next was either Cassandra or Grace Ann. I'm not sure.
Cassandra had her hand up before me.
Oh, I'm not in a hurry, so whatever's fine with me.
Go for it, Cass.
So I really love this. I think this reminds me a lot of like how I teach my daughter. I do think I don't know exactly where this plays, but I have a couple thoughts. And of course, I want to work with you on this because I'm obsessed with toxic masculinity. I was inundated in a very toxic masculine household and multi-generational things going on. Amazingly, our women are the strongest purveyors and reinforcers of this toxic masculinity. And I think for me personally, I feel like I love toxic men. And I think it's because I feel they need to be loved. And this sort of is like what Rohny is trying to do, I think, for the veterans. And like, I feel that if they have an example close to them, talking about leaving your community or providing new members into your community that can show you a different way of existing, like this is why I think I've been like just chronically attracted to toxic masculinity. I'm like, yeah, that's my altruistic mission, I guess, to reverse that process. But I think I want to just acknowledge one thing. Being a somewhat younger generation parent, I have a 1-year-old and a 6-year-old at home. Um, I don't know where this plays into what you do, Rohny, but I do think, I mean, as always, it has to be polarizing. So there is definitely still a chronic reinforcement of toxic masculinity. I do think, and I don't know if this is the counter, and I don't know where exactly this comes into. I don't know if this is a theory paper you're working on or practically how this applies to what you're doing. But I do think there is sort of an anti that going on in younger generation parenting. What I mean by that is gender fluidity as one example, but also sort of almost overprotecting as a response to the underprotecting and like the harsh like rigidity of what you're talking about. um I don't think I have an argument to say that that somehow is becoming a more dominant narrative. I don't agree with that. I think that even in the space of like the woke culture, I love, um I think there's still a lot of toxic masculinity. I also think what you're talking about, is very relevant to, given the gender fluidity that's starting to become prominent in our culture. I think the toxic masculinity is very relevant for women like me. I identify as a female. I don't have gender ambiguity myself for my brain, but like, what is that anyway? But I think a lot of the toxic masculinity traits that you're talking about have been imprinted on me, as it relates to being a successful, independent woman. So, and I think this is a lot of stuff that they talk about in gender research, how we have to compensate for toxic masculinity, which is a different part of the same puzzle. Women have become representations of toxic masculinity. So that's all. Thank you.
Mhm.
Grace Ann, are you waiting for me? Because
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I like this, Ronnie. I like the chart and the words and the idea that we can only experience what we have words for, and or at least that depth of experience that is associated with the word. And I'm wondering about patterns. So, like, maybe it's parents, maybe it's Jean-Luc Picard, but somewhere we observe a pattern, I guess, but you can't observe everything. So what I'm thinking is, how do we do this to ourselves by that urge to create a pattern? We see a couple of bits and pieces and then we extend that to a whole pattern, because I don't think we have the capacity to remember enough details to guide us in every situation. So we are imposing it on ourselves of what we think the pattern is, and we extend it and make it a pattern. So anyway, I don't know if that's fits with what you're looking at, but I was just thinking of, how do we get these, because it's the pattern is what is dominating our behavior, I think, and that belief that we need to operate according to it. And, for myself, I remember when I was in college thinking it was hard to find a pattern, to find a role model that I liked. And I didn't know if that was going to be a problem or not.
Mm-hmm.
And, maybe that's something we should be looking at, that we learn, teach our children not to expect consistency. I don't know. But something about the pattern and its power and how we can adapt it to serve ourselves rather than become a slave to it.
Mm-hmm.
So, per your comment, Grayson, there is this thing we call masculinity. And without a clear definition, we all seem to have a pretty fair sense of what we mean anyway. And Bell Hooks, in her book, The Will to Change, talks about the ways in which, as Cassandra was saying, women will reinforce and perpetuate toxic masculinity. They'll do that because they will demand it of partners. They'll do it because they will demand it of boys. And they'll do that because they're following a pattern that they see. And it would seem to me that a lot of that pattern, what you're talking about, Grayson, is what a lot of people are trying to get at when they talk about whatever concept, whether it's institutional logics or ideologies or grand narratives. What we're really getting at are these sort of caricatures of life that we tend to live into. And then the question is, how do we, as you said, how do we make it so that instead of us serving it, it serves our values, our heart of care, right? And I really like that. And so I would guess that Betty is right. Maybe this is a historical analysis. Certainly, I've seen an analysis going back every generation, from this generation back to Aristotle, of things that were written that say, boys these days just aren't real men anymore. And part of that is a reinforcement of a demand that we maintain, as Betty says, a warrior nation. And far and away, I think that domestically we try to curtail what we demand culturally so that internationally we can have that power, so that we can be that that Vikinger class, right? Now, Vikinger, that's a verb, right? Viking is not a person; it's just someone who goes out trading. They are trading goods around the world, and they invade because they got better trades to make, right? Or you didn't open up your port to make a trade. Like, this is what America does. This is the disposition of our military, is the maintenance of international trade. So I would say we have taken on the Vikinger heritage and continued it on and become those that warrior trader ideal. And that's core. Like this is, to me, America, along with France, those are the first nations that are understood in the way we see nations, not as a king with a religion, but as a people together. And we are based on not blood and soil, but an ethos, pursuit of life, our own life, liberty, that is to take liberties with our property, which is our pursuit of happiness. Property and happiness are the same there in John Locke. So it is our right to maintain our own life wherein we take liberties with property. That is the founding saying of America.
Mm.
And we then build a mythological ground of being where we take for granted our ways of being, which uphold sexual assault, uphold domestic violence, because these are the two proper things for masculine activities. And we don't do it by saying, oh, well, it's good to beat people. It's, spouse, it's good to sexually assault someone. We don't say that. But when 10,000 men laugh at a joke and 1,000 men justify the joke as kind of telling the truth, then 100 men are sympathetic to one man who's actually doing it. And that's how we get to this point of extreme behavior. There's a whole pyramid of acceptance, just a little bit at a time, all the way out.
Mm.
So that's my thinking on those comments. I know Cassandra has her hand up. And then Grace Ann wanted to say something.
Someone's gonna have to help me change my Zoom name to Cassie so I can stop being called by my 19th century name. I I I think I love the idea of studying the history of it as because and I do think I was just gonna comment on your mention about America. And it's only because as I'm writing this conclusion to my dissertation, there's apparently an anti-woke movement, culture war in the UK as well. And I think maybe that just kind of reminds me, and maybe something to remind you, depending on what you're doing with this, is like, I think Betty's right, but I think it stems all the way back from like the origins of organizing human beings, right? Like I think this is something that has been in us as people who exist in community from the inception of our existence in community. So I think I don't know what the answers might be or how we might get to them by understanding fully like how this progression has somehow continued. Obviously, lack of context, right? Like we don't have the same needs for toxic masculinity that we did thousands of years ago.
Mhm.
In America, however many years ago since it started, right? So like I think I think it's a global phenomenon for sure. And then I think maybe um yeah, this is my argument always against social psychology. Like, if we could figure out how it really got embedded so deeply, then could we reverse the embedding, or could we, like to the point about a counter, could we embed a new narrative that's strong enough to counter the effects of the existing narrative?
Mhm.
I think Betty, unless Grace. Grace sounds always so humble. I know it's Betty.
Yeah, Grace Ann, did you want to say something? Okay, all right. So, I agree with, is it Cassie or Kathy?
It's Cass.
Okay, Cass. All right. I agree with Cass that we've got to go back even further and see how it got embedded in the first place, because that is the only way we're going to be able to do any reverse engineering, if we can. But to that question, okay, I know I defended the idea of America going to war all the time and needing its men to be strong, not weak, and their definition of strong being aggressive and all that. But let's all remember that patriarchy, the Bible set up the conditions of such a thing early on. And so my feeling right now, looking at the states from abroad, is that we simply accelerated it big time with our choices. Patriarchy was always going to be oppressive to the non-males, and in America, non-white males. But it does seem to me that the acceleration of it came with the feeling that we were such a great nation that we could bully everybody else. And to just add one other factor, as nothing is ever simple, I'd like to remind you of something David introduced. It was an introduction for me. Maybe you all knew about it. Do you remember liquid modernity, Zygmunt Bauman? Well, his point, I've reread recently the book that I checked out. Actually, I bought it when I was in the Las Cruces. I couldn't believe it. I found it, and David had mentioned it recently, and I bought it on the spot and took years to even plug through it. But his idea really is that anytime you try to define boundaries between things, the boundaries are going to be slippery, and that as time moves on, nothing is holding exactly as we learned it when we were children. You could probably introduce, since he wrote it, what social media is doing and our interconnections on internet. But his point really was that the role of men in society is necessarily going to fuse with other things that are going on, and that you need to not so much track where it goes, but to never expect it to be one thing only. So you're actually going after a moving target. All right.
So you're right, Betty. I did introduce some Zygmunt Bauman in particular. I got to go to Finland, and Zygmunt Bauman was given a talk, you know, and so the university I was at, I said, I really want to go see Zygmunt Bauman, and so they called over there, and they said, well, it's sold out, you know, they can't even sit in the aisles, it's just packed, and so I said, oh darn, I really wanted to go to that. So just before the event's going to happen, a few hours, somebody called over and say, well, okay, Professor Boji can go to see Zygmunt Bauman and he can bring one person. So I found one person. We went there in Helsinki, you know, and it was true. Everybody was sitting in the aisles and they were in the doorways, and it was one of those tiered ballroom kind of thing, you know, tiered, you know, like steps, people who are in steps.
And what did you think, David?
Well, they put me in the front row. They had a reserved for Professor Boji and his guests in the front row. I mean, Zygmunt Bauman could spit on me. He didn't, but I mean, I'm right there with Zygmunt Bauman and liquid modernity. And he, and I remember him talking with no notes. And I thought, oh my God, no notes, no PowerPoint, no slides, nothing. He's just standing there and he's, per your point, he says, you know, you could put the word culture in the internet. You know, he didn't say Google, but you could do a search for the word culture and you're going to get back like a 1.5 million or something. Articles, definitions, Facebooks, whatever on culture, and they're going to be pretty disagreeing, you know. He said they don't need teachers anymore. We need somebody that's going to sort out how to interpret all this information that's overloading us, you know. But I remember that and other things too. And so I asked him about questions, some of his books and stuff, just to show that I was awake, and you know, and he was tolerant of the questions. So the end came, and then somebody came and tapped me on the shoulder. Zygmunt Bauman and his group want you to go to dinner with them. I
Mm.
said, oh yeah, I'll go, but not your guest. And we went to this great restaurant, and I believe it was snow outside and stuff, and the restaurant had these glass windows, uh, top and sides, and kind of a dome effect. Anyway, and they put me right across from him, and I tried to ask him a question, and so the lady next to him, who's like his caregiver, whispered in his ear, Mr. Boji has a question. And Zygmunt couldn't hear. His hearing was mostly gone,
Not yet.
And
Mm.
and he looked at me and he looked at the pen I'd made. I make these pens. I gave some to Ronnie and Julian and Betty, I
Mm.
guess.
Yep,
And
absolutely. Mm.
and he says, I like your pen.
Mm.
How did you do that?
Mm.
So he wanted to talk about my art and not all anyway, I'm completely off the topic, but I wanted to say that, yeah, liquid modernity had a big impact on me, and
Yeah,
I really appreciated it.
yeah.
His,
I'm reading it now, David. It's very interesting to learn of a concept that is so new, like it was new to me. Let the years go by and read it again and realize how you're not the same person reading it today that you were reading it back then. And the main point I can tell you that I get from it is we are all in a tailspin. Our heads are spinning from how nothing is the same anymore, and you can't count on it being the same tomorrow either. So I wondered if he himself was observing um, how Finland was changing,
oh
uh,
yeah,
and trying to make sense of it. Yeah,
yeah,
Americans.
he's from another country than Finland. Uh,
Okay.
yeah, I think it's Poland, if I'm not
Oh
mistaken.
yeah, yeah. You're right. I knew that. Gosh, yeah, he from Poland. But it is true that Americans have tried to hang on to things more than other countries would because we needed America to be this exceptional place. We needed to know that the world was looking up to us for things. We've got more abandoning to do of what was always a myth anyway. The
Yeah, it
rest
was
of
a
them,
myth. It was a myth. I want to respond to that a little more, but let somebody else have a
okay.
go if they want. But I want to come back to something that Kathy the Great said. So, or I'll just do it. I don't know. What do you want to do, Ronnie? It's your show.
Just very, very briefly, thinking about Bowman. If we come back to Cass's point about maybe this is just how humanity is, or Betty's historicization into the Bible, I think the Bible is a very good example. And I got this from the book Dawn of Everything. Masculinity and this sort of like dominating women, treating them as property, severing the totality of masculine experience. This is a warrior act by disenfranchised farmers who look into a city where women and men are free to live the lives that they want. They say, my daughter has been stolen by the city, and they go to get their property back. And this is what's called inequity over and over again in the Old Testament. For example, the anthropological record shows us that while everyone in the region was related to the Israelites except the Canaanites, in fact, the Israelites were Canaanites. They were, in fact, the rural Canaanites who formed their own part of the pantheon, who took El and his Asherah, that's his wife. They gave Asherah to Adonai, who was their god, elevated him to the top of the food chain, and said, conflated him with El, and said, oh, you know where all the women went? It was into those cities, and those are full of iniquity. Our God has ordered us to go and kill these people in these awful cities that are so full of iniquity and put the women back in their place. And this schismogenesis, generation of a new culture because you hate the other culture so much, happens over and over again. It seems the only way out of it is to have a greater strength in the city than there is in the rural area, so that the rural does not think that they will be able to dominate the city and kill everyone in it, which is pretty darn rare on the ground since the rural area has all the food. So I would say that this is not an inevitability of humanity, but it is a very common process of women's liberation and men's patriarchal physical assault on men, on women and men that have been liberated. But we don't have to let it happen.
Okay, I gotta
Oh, Grace Ann has something.
I gotta get in after Grace Ann because Grace Ann always goes first. Go ahead.
You can go first, David.
Oh, Grace
No,
Ann.
no, no, no way. No way. I might want to just sort of say after you say it, you know.
Getting maybe a little bit off track here, but I think what Cass said earlier about the femininity, creating its opposite. They're co-created, and the dualism of masculinity, femininity, one half can't exist without the other, and we're reinforcing back and forth. It made me think of, remember Torkild and Louise? So they visited us here, and they're what, Swedish first, aren't they?
They are totally Swedish. I mean, these are the
Yeah.
most Swedish people he ever met.
And, in the old days, Torkild referred to it as gender bending. He and Louise would dress alike, and you couldn't tell who was male and who was female. And we always just thought, oh, that's just them. But connecting it with this discussion, I'm starting to maybe see some of possibly why they were making that point. How we co-create the other side, and how difficult it is to overcome that dualism. And some people think that the only way we think is through dualism. Something is, and we compare it to what it is not. And so, that's a scary thought. That's
very scary.
But I think Torkild dressing as he did in those days might be one of the only ways we can get beyond that stuff.
You got to picture bright yellow banana colored pants that Torkild was wearing, and
I would say
whatever,
probably not
a
pants. I think
ruffled shirt and
they were leggings.
leggings.
Pants.
And we took him to the Western Mercantile, and
Yeah,
he went nuts buying boots and cowboy chaps. And we took him to a real restaurant. We took him to meet a real cowboy, the guy that was the foreman for the Ted Turner Ranch. Well, Ted Turner took it over, and then he quit. He said, "I won't be a foreman for the Ted Turner Ranch. I quit." But he's got a hand that could wrap around your whole head, So John, yeah, he's a really cool guy. Anyway, so he's over here buying all this Western masculinity stuff, and he's going to go back to Sweden. He's going to wear it just to mess with the Swedes, And so anyway, he's a good guy. I wanted to respond. I'm going through my 99th life crisis now, which is exciting for me at age 78, which is to contradict all the Catholic training I had, on who's God. And so I'm reading the Gospel of Thomas. I'm reading some historical documents about Mary Magdalene and Mary, et cetera, et cetera, and I'm questioning the whole thesis that God is this warrior cult, revenge oriented narcissist that does genocide in the Old Testament. And I'm saying that that's a Catholic manifestation of a part of the Torah of one of the sects at the time, whatever it was, Ronnie, you mentioned one of them. But it's if the historical stuff, literary criticism, and the historical documents, if they're to be taken seriously, and the word Catholic wasn't even invented until the third century, you know, and it and if the Bible was so manipulated by King James, by Constantinople, by his wife, who went and picked the historical sites of Jesus and got half of them wrong. Now, historically, the archaeologists are saying, well, that's not the site where he died. That's not, maybe he got Mount Sinai right, but he didn't get the burial part right. So, if liquid modernity is liquefying Catholicism, I'm saying go for it. And because who needs a solidity that says God is a hateful God and a revenge seeking God? I say bullshit. If if the book of Thomas is right, then God was loving and Jesus was loving, and all the stuff the cat. And if you guys aren't Catholic, I apologize for this thing, but I got married to Grace Ann, the Catholic Church, and you know we were all so happy and proud. And I'm not saying they don't do nothing, but other than being the biggest landlord on the planet, but other than that, they have perverted a number of things. Like you take the account of Peter. Peter, it says, well, Jesus told me not to tell you that I would really be one of the apostles, but we're not going to tell the other apostles. I mean, what kind of literary critic wouldn't poke holes in that narrative and saying, really, Jesus isn't going to support you, you know? And anyway, so I'm just saying that what I'm doing is saying, well, if I grew up thinking God is this vengeful guy, I got trauma from being a Catholic. I mean, I used to think the nuns, the ropes they had around their waist, the white ropes. I don't know if you went to Catholic school. I did. We were told that the number of knots were the number of dead children, and you better friggin' behave in the classroom, or you're going to be one of them. And I remember the nun, and Mother Teresa was a good nun, by the way. Mother Teresa could actually levitate, not my teacher, Mother Teresa, but somebody named after her. But the historical accounts, she could levitate. And but the other one, I don't know what her was. I don't know, Sister Hitler, whatever her name was. She would march us out, say, "All right, you're all going to be sent home. You're no longer going to be in the Catholic Church. You haven't been paying attention. You didn't memorize your prayers. We're not just going to put your nose in a circle on the chalkboard. I'm sick of beating Boji with the thing. And you know why this ear's taller than the other? Because she pulled me around the room day after day. I'm going like, I was terrified of that woman. I begged the priest one day. I said, let me out of here. I want to go home. Anyway, I'm thinking that I got indoctrinated into a kind of solidity. And you believe what you want. And anything I just said, if it offends you, just freaking ignore it. But I'm thinking, look at my upbringing. And then I meet Grace Ann. She says, oh, let me introduce you to the guru. And he's all about love. And you have the chakras. And I said, chakras would be forbidden in my church. That's my comment. I hope to Kathy.
I
Cass,
do.
Cass is here. Okay. Have one more plug about religion, but mine's gonna be a lot shorter. I do think it is interesting. Obviously, the Bible is a really nice example of this. Um, I also think, and I don't know how this plays into what you're talking about, but I think about how much I couldn't even pretend to believe in the story of Mormons. because it was too modern. It was too much of somebody saying, that guy, I forget his name, but the main guy who was like, "You guys are the chosen ones." And I'm like, "Wait a minute." So I have some good friends who are Mormon, some openish Mormons, right? As much as they can be. And they would say like, "Yeah, this is how it happened." And I'm like, "So you actually believe that like this person just somehow is like somehow more directly tied to God than me?" And they're like, "Yeah." And I'm like, "But so what did they do? Like, how did this schema get going? Is what I am always still thinking about with Mormons. Mormons specifically, just because it's so new. It's like 1950 or whatever. I'm like, that's like 10 days ago. No, comparatively speaking, right? So I think about what I started joking about was like, what if I just come out tomorrow with like a PR report saying that like God called me, I'm the next apostle of the Mormon community? Like, how are people, what would I need to do to look like, to be, to behave, to say that they would go, "It is you." And I'm like, I think in Mormonism, it could never be believed because I'm a woman, I think, but I'm not sure if that's how it works still. But still the question remains, right? Like, Boji, you're like a great candidate for the next apostle because you look white, you're old. Okay, great. So we're like, yeah, cool. You're gonna be the next apostle, right? And I'm like, I don't know. But my point is, right? You're like, you're so wise looking and you've been around, so it would make sense if God called on you, right? And so I'm just wondering, like, how did this get going? You know what I mean? Like, how did this actually happen? Okay. That's my first thing. My second thing is, I would believe you to be an apostle much more than some of the other guys I think they chose, though, just so you know. The second thing is is about the conforming to the masculinity, Ronnie. Okay, so you know this because you know how I raise my kids a lot of times, right? And I struggle sometimes when my best friend gives me hand-me-downs that are so girly for my son, who's one. And I'm like, do I want to deal with the confusion of like, he's a beautiful boy, so they already sometimes call him a girl. He has curls back here and all of this. And I'm like, is it just annoying to me that I have to constantly be like, actually, he's a boy, or like, do I even care? Or like, they'll just keep on going. And then they're sad when they realize he's a boy because they've been calling him a girl. Does it even matter? So, just thinking about that and like how that, even though I don't want to buy into it per se, I think the dichotomy, like the dualism, especially in this country, it makes things more confusing in some ways. And the comparison, and I'll end with this, is in other countries, like for example, um, Latin culture, they still have a lot of, and I'm speaking from my own experience with a Brazilian au pair, but this is, I think, somewhat still common. They still have a lot of toxic masculinity really deeply ingrained in their culture, but there's a huge but. They have expanded the capacity for behavior in certain categories. For example, a husband can have maybe more expressive kinds of love around like family. They can also maybe have like, this is so silly, but they can also maybe have like more passion and like maybe femininity in the space of like dancing or like music, right? Like when you think about salsa and all these other, where like in this country, sometimes like people might say under toxic masculinity that like, oh, you take salsa lessons to a guy, right? So like just I guess to compare, right? There's like the contradicting the sort of woke movement versus the toxic masculinity here. And then there's a different kind of sort of expansion within the established guardrails going on in other places. And I don't know, I'm not sure how one or the other happened, like which one is better if we're like moving in a direction that's like not so much the way that it was, like, those kind of things.
So first, I know we want to look to history to find the answers, but we are going to carry with us the gut check, the historical imagination of the communities we're already embedded in. And that's going to limit our capacity both for cross-cultural comparison and for historical comparison. When you talk about the David, the religious questions, let me turn you on to somebody who's won an award from the biblical scholars. This is Dan McClellan, and he very regularly simply says what the best available scholarship has to say. And very often it contradicts the faith he is, which is Mormon, and it contradicts what you may have been taught in Catholic school, but it certainly gives you what people who have dedicated their lives to understanding the scholarship have to say. His name is Dan McClellan. And I highly recommend it. Very interesting stuff. I see other biblical scholars and professors of religious studies for their various institutions follow up with his statements and say, yes, this is exactly what the scholarship says. The lay people very often don't know what the scholarship says because the preachers will hide it. But the professors are telling the preachers the truth and ask them, stop lying, right? And then there's different interpretations, right? The Catholics have spent 1,500 years inventing the way we do our knowledge, so they're ready for the conversation. And Cass, to the point of religion per se, and then falling back into Grace Ann's follow-up with what she was talking about. This, of course, I think we all know, is a famous picture of FDR. And he killed all the Nazis. So I think your kid can be okay, even if he's pretty as a baby. And then the question that Grace Ann was bringing in, to me, is a follow-up on our integrated conversation around Zygmunt Bauman and how there's this looseness between coupling. As Cass is pointing out, within those couples, there's ways to create more looseness, to try and overcome the enforcement of masculine stoicism. And between those categories, as your Swedish friends were doing, to deter or otherwise just question these taken for granted assumptions about gender roles. And in that way, if we can see people that we would respect enacting gender in diverse ways, so too can we respect ourselves and others in that enactment. And I think that's exactly, you're right, Grace Ann, what they were trying to help people get at. And too often, folks who do that are treated as though they are disrespectable, and sort of an immune system against allowing ourselves to simply be in a way that is more emotionally open. So that's my take on the conversations. Oh, Grace Ann, David?
I'm going to speak in defense of Catholic schools. I went for several years, not that long, and I went to a Catholic college too. But when I was 10 years old, and I told David this story, when I was 10 years old, I was in a Catholic school, and I was in Mass one day when I was remembering something that I had read somewhere about Catholic prayer. And it stuck in my head. And many years later in college, when I learned about transcendental meditation, I said, it's the same thing. It's what I read when I was 10 years old and remembered vividly thinking about in the Mass at 10 years of age. There's so much there. We pick and choose the interpretation we want to make from it. And, you know, I know a lot of people who feel the Catholic Church damaged them, and I don't know why I happened to see these different elements, but I did, and they were there. And I knew priests and brothers who recognized these dynamics. Even my mother, who was not a very philosophical person, very practical, put the food on the table kind of mom. And I said to her one time, what I read in the catechism was that if you don't think something's a sin, it's not a sin. And she said, you're right. So it's in there. It's all in there. It just depends on what you choose to emphasize. And that was one of the things that they did not choose to emphasize.
Okay, for another point of view. I'm really glad I met Grace Ann, and I'm glad we married in the Catholic Church. She was beautiful coming down the aisle, I want to tell you. And on the one side of the church sat 182 Italians, and on the other side of the church were 5 Bogies. So you just get a picture of that church, you know. But I was glad that my sons and daughter came to see me get married. My mother flew in too for it, so it was pretty special. My dad was terrified, though. I'm not going to go where your mother is. They were divorced and stuff at the time. So anyway, but you know, it was pretty cool. Yeah. So if I've been misled in the Catholic Church, and I think I have been, um, you know, I'm not saying that there's no value in it, that, you know, but I am saying that they stand between me and God. They stand between me and Jesus, if I'm going to go that route. And I don't need anybody standing between me and my source, the source, you know, because what I learned in Jainism is my divinity is within me. And if I take a number of scriptures, like Grace Ann was saying, if I choose this one or that one or the other one, the seed is in with me too in some of those scriptures. Now, if I'm now 78 years old and I'm learning that I can have a direct relationship, that's a whole other kind of thing. And a point I wanted to make about women, just a couple of points, but first of all, my dissertation chair was a Mormon bishop, and now he's on the Mormon, one of the top, I don't know if there's a top 12 Mormons in the world, that would be him. And he was a nice fellow, and he took me, you know, okay, I had to play up to him a little bit, get my dissertation approved. First of all, he had the funding for the study, you know, he did that, and you know, he introduced me to the Mormon church. So the Mormons believe that all the babies that come down are already in heaven, and if you choose not to have one, they're not going to come down. So that's a heck of a responsibility. And Joseph Smith founded the Mormon Church in 1830, you know, and they very organized religion. On Sunday day of worship, they speak the same sermon and exactly the same word around the world. That's how organized it is. You know, there's none of this. The priest is going to say this about Easter and that about this, and another in Detroit and another one in Chicago. It's all going to be the same words. But they have another meeting, I think, if I recall, is on Saturdays, where you can have spaghetti meal together. That was good. I liked the spaghetti. And people would pop up and kind of like the Quakers, and they would pop up and give a testimony, you know, about what was going on in their life or something they were led. I'm led to say the following, and da 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 da. You know, off they'd go, and then somebody else would pop up. So I thought that was kind of cool. But I was thinking back to like Mary Magdalene and Mary. You consider the male-dominated toxic cultures of the 4 sects of Judaism, and then what formed of the Christians and the Gnostic rebels that were there, one of the sects. I don't remember the names of the other 3. But in all of them, women had no standing, 0 standing. So the Catholics had to make Mary Magdalene into a prostitute, a harlot, because there was no legitimate role in the Catholic Church for a woman to have, and they had to wrestle with Joan of Arc. So that was another story, but they had to make of that. Now, the historical Mary Magdalene, some say probably was Jesus's wife, because how can you be a Jewish rabbi in a Jewish sect where they said you must be married? I mean, that's the Catholics saying you don't be married, but in the old time, you had to be married, you know? So they cut out 18 years of his life, and possibly he was married to Mary Magdalene, had children, and they have to erase all of that history. And then Mary the mother, she has the virgin birth. Well, that's weird. And then she lives, and you don't see her again until Christ is crucified. So there's like zero historical account of her biblically in between those two events, and so that's weird. But actually, she had a life as a Jewish woman, mother, but she had to deal with a very male culture. Anyway, that's what my reading of it is. Aho, I'm done. Off to Kathy.
Um, I'm just going to assume the role of Kathy the Great because I really like that title.
The first year I knew David, I assumed the role of Rohny.
I'm like, my name means nothing to me, which is a good signal of my openness, I feel. Um, I love this conversation and I really appreciate being literally right in between Dave and Grace Ann because I feel like it's like fated. You know what I mean? Like the universe has set it up this way. What you guys are talking about to me is something that I feel like I noticed at a very young age in my life. And I feel like I'm like, this is the answer. No, okay, I'm not so naive, but like, I feel like what this has to do with, which I don't know the source of it, but I think what this has to do with is how well, so this is one of my terms from my dissertation, how much the individual has a socio-cultural fitness to the environment. So I'm calling it legitimate authenticity, and there's a whole thing about it. But the point is this, right? If I go into a space, for example, like I did when I was growing up. And my mom's like, you should get a job. You should do this. You should care about achievement. You should care about this. And I'm over here and I'm like, I'm in my head a little bit. And I'm like, but I really care about people. And like, I really want to be forgiving. And she's like, you shouldn't let people treat you that way. And I'm like, but they're kind of like, it's not really their fault. They're suffering. And I'm just like, contradiction, 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 right? So like, I feel like, I don't know your whole life story, either of you guys, that would be a whole nother conversation. But I feel like the reason why some people are more able, and I think Ronnie and I have these conversations a lot actually because of our different upbringings and life experience. I think this is exactly why we have these differences of opinions and philosophies. Like depending on how well you have fit in your environment as you progress, and like what you maybe do about small differences, I think that ultimately is what determines whether you are able to, like, I hate to be like, be so positive about Catholicism, like Grace Ann, versus being more cynical about Catholicism, like Dave. So, like, I think it's a really good point that you bring up because I feel like it sort of goes back to what I was saying about how I feel about toxic masculinity. You know what I mean? I just see it as a representation of suffering. And like, so I feel really charged towards it. And so I think like that's maybe why these stark differences. But this brings up a really good question as it relates to your topic, Ronnie. And I think this question is like how could we help people be more open, like maybe Grace Ann was, to regarding positive qualities of the negative environment, even though, to Ronnie's point, right, we acknowledge that it's negative. That was his first thing that he said, was that we could say, like, about the smoking in the car. I think about road rage, right? Then if at least I look at it and I go, it sucks. That's, there's no good about that, right? But what is the good, right? And then asking yourself the balance. So I think you guys are really beautiful examples of like, in some ways, like very similar I guess. It's a similar topic, although you experienced it very differently. And saying that, like, depending on how aligned you are with the outside to begin with, I think has a huge factor. Like, how does it imprint upon you? Is it like a guiding factor or is it an oppressing factor? And I think depending on which one it is for you and your natural resting disposition, you can really go. That's why I feel like it's crazy because people who grew up in Mormon culture, there's either like the still Mormons that are like, this is great, or there's the ones that are like, don't talk to me about Mormonism. It can't possibly be good. That's it. There's only two. Like, that's been my experience. I don't know. You show me a different one. I'd be loving to talk to them about why they're different, you know?
So we have Betty and Grace Ann.
Okay. Well, I don't know if Grace Ann wanted to respond immediately to that. What I would like to say is that this is a perfect time to bring up Bakhtin, because I feel like he would answer your question differently than some of us might do it. Let's not forget that the inner voices and the voices of those who came before us and our society, or what you call environmental, what's coming out of the environment, are all speaking to us. And not only that, but we're speaking to each other through, okay, we've got different backgrounds. So Grace Ann and David, which is the perfect example right now, have such an influence on each other that part of the answer comes from what they've been able to teach each other. David is always giving Grace Ann credit, but I'm sure that Grace Ann isn't who she would have been had she not met David. And the example of his riding horses, etc., they become the result of these voices between them. And why that's important to this discussion is that religion is what we are able to get from it. It bounces. I think we even give it more meaning than what the original creators meant it to give. And for example, the day that I understood that Constantine, oh, do we say Constantine? Anyway, the guy in Constantinople, when he called together a conference to decide which of the books of the Bible would survive and which ones wouldn't, and whether Arianism or not Arianism would, and he had rigged the whole system against Arianism. But I took a look at that. It was like a huge voice shouting at me, Betty, these people have manipulated what you've considered. I was a Southern Baptist as a child. So you can imagine when I thought, what the kind of things that our preacher called the word of God directly from him, people had thrown out or accepted according to their own, not their whims, but the meaning that they wanted to give to it all. So all of that is to say, I love the way Bakhtin would show us that our voices are intermingled with these things that religion has done with us, for us, against us, and against is what I felt like I was seeing. I wasn't like Grace Ann with the Catholic Church. The Southern Baptist for me were actually full of it when I discovered what it was all about. And I was becoming old enough to know that they belittled me as a human being, which is not what Jesus talked about women like, you know. So I recently saw Scorsese's The Last Temptation and Mel Gibson's the Passion of the Long
Right.
Suffering of Christ. Yeah, the Passion. And in both cases, they were trying to say, let's cut through all of the dogma that's around it and look at how this guy suffered in the name of humanity moving forward. So that's an interpretation that I'm going to try to hang on to a little bit rather than which, when you talked about Peter, for example, David, I thought, oh yeah, here we go again with these books that did survive Constantine's judgment. But I do think that David and Grace Ann were a good example, Cassie. Thank you for that.
Grace Ann.
So, thank you, Betty. And you're leading into the point I was going to make, which was all of this stuff about our own religious experiences and beliefs have a tangential meaning for this, but I think it is tangential. To me, we should get back to the point that Rohny made about the dropout rate changing because people had permission or discovered that they had the ability to experience different emotions, so that the situation was in a way punishing and restrictive when people are subject to not being able to experience a range of emotions. And Rohny, I'd like you to say a little more about what was the program they were in and what can you do in other contexts short of actually teaching that list that you gave.
Yeah. So the system is called the ruler system. So the book Permission to Feel. It was
Could you repeat that? It's a
a
what?
ruler, RULER. It stands for recognize your emotions, understand their causes, label them precisely, and then express those feelings so that you can then regulate your responses. RULER. So that's the process that's taught. And when it was taught just to students, along with the mood meter, which happens under the L part of the label, it didn't work. It worked when the teachers learned it. Because as we're talking about, the nature of our being is related to one another in constant dialogue. And these, like Bakhtinian dialogisms, show us who we are, voices from the past, but voices from the environment, voices that we look up to. We look up to our teachers. If our teachers tell us one thing but exist in another way, we have no model for that different way of being. So we must be in the way that we seek others to follow. And it turns out we're going to do that anyway. People are going to look at you. They're going to decide whether they like what you're doing, and they're going to follow you or they're not. So we have a moral responsibility to take responsibility for our own way of being and express it so that people can, as you're asking, recognize, understand, label, express, and regulate how they're feeling. And that was very effective. That's what went from 80% dropout to 20% dropout.
And what was the program?
Yeah, it's called the Permission to Feel program. It's by this. The book is Permission to Feel. The program is called the Ruler Framework, and it was one of many studies he did. He started off by writing the book because he wanted, in doing his doctoral work, and now he was tenured at like Yale, because he was molested as a child. And when he told his parents, they told him he was lying, which is the most common response. And so he wanted and spends a lot of time being in a really bad place because he had no permission to feel, and worked towards how other people could have that, and found that there's all sorts of kinds of abuse that people are living through that are then being perpetuated through them. So there.
Rohny, can I wrap up and then we'll go off camera?
For sure.
Okay, so this is ENthinkment Circle. We want to thank Rohny Saylors for talking to us about toxic masculinity and its impact on our society and culture and history and our future. So thank you for coming, and I appreciate you. And